You're watching The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. It's nice to be joined from Minneapolis actually, by Dr. Raymond Kuo. He's a political scientist and an author of several books, including one of the reasons why we chose to speak to him today, which is Confronting China's gray zone strategy in the East and South China Sea. He's been an ex-foreign policy analyst as well for what's now Taiwan's ruling party, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. Dr. Kuo, glad to have you on StratNews, and thank you for coming live to us so early in the morning there.
Thank you for having me, Amitabh.
Dr. Kuo, we wanted to just look at what's been happening with Taiwan, and it's not been only recent. When you look at both China's military moves in the ADIZ or other coercive action, when Xi Jinping says his goal, or the Communist Party's goal, is to reunify Taiwan, if necessary, by force by 2049, do you see any of the events that are taking place having pulled back that deadline, if I can call it that?
No, certainly not. I mean, tensions are rising between China and Taiwan, and also, of course, between China and the United States. I think Xi Jinping is under domestic pressure to, he's staked his political credibility on being on this sort of national rejuvenation, this China dream that he calls it. And so anything that kind of retards that or holds it back, well, it's going to hurt him politically. And so he's still driving forward with this.
Still driving forward, and we're seeing some of the tweets from the president and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. There's been some movement after President Biden took over as well. In continuation, if you can look at it in that sense of what the Trump administration was doing, that we were seeing was a Coast Guard agreement between the US and Taiwan. Now, how significant is Beijing's behavior dependent on what is happening between the US and Taiwan?
Oh, I mean, there's always been a strategic interaction, right? Whenever the U.S. Gets closer to Taiwan, for example, through arms sales, China will always protest. The U.S. has also pivoted back and forth between China and Taiwan as well. So, if to curtail moves towards Taiwanese independence, the U.S. will kind of swing towards China. Right now, what I think is changing is that China is getting the independent capability. So it doesn't need to, the U.S. is no longer able to play that pivotal role between China and Taiwan to prevent conflict. Instead, China right now has the ability to say, we have the capabilities to assert ourselves within this region. So why not we try to do that? So I think, yes, China is responding to American moves and sort of diplomatic outreach to Taiwan, but at the same time, they're trying to kind of free themselves from that constraint by developing both conventional and sort of sub-conventional military capabilities. And also initiatives like economic exchanges with neighboring states, social pressure, that kind of thing.
When you're talking about pressure, military pressure, the ADIZ, where Taiwan consistently says there are days when up to 20 PLA aircraft have entered that region. You have the aircraft carrier, the warships as well in that region. What is being hoped to be achieved by Beijing there, apart from attrition or wearing down the defenders in Taiwan?
Sure. I mean, certainly wearing them down is an important goal in and of itself. But I think beyond that, there's this information gathering or testing or probing kind of approach that you want to see what they're capable of. And you want to see exactly how far you can extend them, because if it ever did come to a shooting war, you get a better sense of their capabilities and what you should then therefore do. I think also it's a matter of normalization to suggest that, hey, we're claiming this territory as ours, or we're no longer going to abide by the median line that informally has divided China from Taiwan through the Taiwan Strait. And to normalize that sense of, we're here, you can't force us out, this is now our territory. Now, I'm not sure, militarily, I don't think it actually, that sort of political signal does very much. Because it's not like you're going to successfully coerce Taiwan to recognize China's claim just by having military overflights. But it does send a broader signal to the rest of the region that, hey, we're asserting ourselves here, you all need to stay out of this. and then there's information gathering and sort of exhaustion elements as well.
Well, that is the case. Many analysts say even with what happened on India's northern borders with Tibet last year, in which 20 Indian soldiers were killed and an unspecified number of Chinese, well, they are testing both militarily and possibly to see how both, whether it's Taiwan's political reaction or the American political reaction, or like you're saying, the region's reactions, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, this is kind of it's part of a broader case of what I go into my book about gray zone strategies. The idea that you want to do you want to keep things below the level of conventional warfare. And if you can create sub-conventional capabilities that can overwhelm the other side, well, because you haven't gotten up the threshold of conventional warfare, nobody wants to, pull the trigger and go to war. But you can actually make gains in terms of seizing territory, sending political signals, coercing regional rivals to keep them out of particular areas. Through these sort of sub-conventional capabilities. So I think it is a manifestation in all these cases of the gray zone sort of strategy. I think the biggest issue for Taiwan, however, is that at least with Taiwan, it's the most militarized. Taiwan and Vietnam. That with Taiwan, you're seeing the actual People's Liberation Army Air Force and Navy actually getting involved, whereas the other situations tend to be lower level, sometimes deniable forces. Less so in the case of India, but certainly in terms of the maritime zone, absolutely that's the case.
Like a so-called fishing fleet near the Philippines in the Whitsun Reef, right?
Exactly.
But we've seen what happened in Mischief Reef earlier. I think in your earlier answer, you have taken it from one of our viewers, this question from Varun Pratap, by engaging in frequent incursions into Taiwan's ADIZ and trying to deplete Taiwanese resources, is China building up pressure on Taiwan to accept a fait accompli? And you said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that a military coercion itself was not enough.
Sorry, I missed that last part. Military coercion itself is not?
I mean, that's what you were saying, that just what China was doing in terms of its Navy, its Air Force, was not enough to say, to get Taiwan to say, okay, you take us over.
That's right. I mean, because there is military control, but then there is also the political backlash. It's no surprise that, for example, Hong Kong identity and Taiwanese identity have just kind of shot up the ranks in terms of, people in Taiwan or people in Hong Kong, their kind of self-identification because of these threats. There's a very clear backlash in terms of what China may be able to establish control, but it's actually angered quite a number of people in the region, as well as in Taiwan and Hong Kong, to say, like, no, we're not interested in being part of your sort of order or regime or system, because this is, you've already shown that you will use force when you want to, and we're just not interested in that. So despite the fact that its military power has increased, despite the fact that it is able to increasingly assert control, it's also lost the battle for hearts and minds, just completely. I think John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago, great political scientist, had said that, speaking of the Trump administration's Asia policy, said that, look, it's he considers the policy to be a disaster, but he said the one benefit for American policy in the last 4 years is that China has been worse. It's alienated much of the region, and even as it's increasing in military strength.
You were talking about your book and gray zone warfare, and I think you had explained that. If you just do that a little bit deeper, because there's a question from Tara, one of our regular viewers, who says, does gray warfare against Taiwan involve a biological warfare? You're talking about subconventional or below subconventional warfare, right?
Right, exactly. And this, I mean, it depends on how you arrange things. This would be sort of unconventional, obviously nuclear, biological, chemical warfare. I would doubt that it involves biological warfare for a couple of reasons. One, if it ever got out that this was the case, it would just trigger an even higher backlash within Taiwan against China. Part of what makes Taiwan valuable is that it's a large economy. It has great infrastructure, great industries, and so the last thing you want to do, and also like a very well educated and active population, the last thing you want to do is hurt those people, because you would eventually want to kind of make use of them, to put it in kind of blunt terms. I recall 10, 15 years ago, China threatened Taiwan by saying it had a neutron bomb. But they could wipe out the Taiwanese population, but leave much of the material intact. And A, I think this was a bit of an exaggeration. B, it kind of undermines the whole goal of taking over Taiwan, which is not just to show that we can take over Taiwan, but also that we can integrate it reunify within this sort of grand sort of national project. It's hard to do that if it's just a bombed out wreck with nobody there.
Well, one of the areas that Beijing is operating is information warfare, and Harsh Bihare has this question. How is Taiwan tackling the Chinese information warfare and PSYOPs? And in cyber warfare, is that a sector where India and, say, Taiwan can cooperate?
Oh, I think it's not just for India and Taiwan, but the entire region needs to cooperate on this. So the Chinese strategy in cyber warfare, or at least with, say, social media, seems to be flooding the zone with just a lot of opinion that supports China. So, for example, there's a couple ways to do it, right? You could try to find and influence particular social media stars and change their opinion and get them to kind of cascade down on with their followers. And so you actually have an actual person changing their mind, and then it can have this sort of trickle-down effect. However, for the Chinese, at least with relation to Taiwan, they just get all of their netizens and just flood all the social media sites with pro-China policies and tweets and that kind of thing. It creates the impression that there's a massive movement out there against your position. But a lot of that could be bots. It could be just people just clicking having multiple profiles. And so it's a different type of strategy to combat that. You can get around that, for example, by having bot filters. Or working with social media companies to kind of cull through some of these things. Whereas if you were to try to target social media influencers, that becomes much harder to do. So fortunately, I think that the strategy China is taking right now in terms of cyber warfare, at least social media propaganda warfare, is amenable to cooperation, especially amongst the Asia-Pacific region. If they change their strategy, that involves a different response.
Ashish Kumar asks Dr. Kuo, can Taiwan give China a dent in other areas, for example, in business, apart from military ones? And we know semiconductors and high technology is one area where China could be affected, and there are moves on various fronts between countries to try and get supply chains in those fronts, especially in high technology and rare minerals working.
Yeah, and I think especially since COVID, there's been a push to pull back extended supply chains to make it a little closer to home, so that you're not dependent upon shocks, whether disease-wise or some sort of economic or supply shock halfway across the world. That said, I think China and Taiwan are economically pretty intertwined. The semiconductor industry in Taiwan depends a lot upon the manufacturing and assembly processes that happen in China. And so I don't think, well, yes, Taiwan could, kind of fight back against China in that way. It's by kind of restricting supplies. It's a bit of a lose-lose situation all around. Taiwan would hurt itself in addition to hurting China. And unfortunately, right now, in this particular situation, China's economy is just much larger. It can weather a lot of these shocks better than, say, Taiwan can. Better than, frankly, most countries can.
Well, I mean, there have been moves. Of course, the business climate in India is one issue, but this is Make in India semiconductors that Tamara Musialska asks about. I'm just going to take another one from Shahid Desi, who says, how is the Biden administration viewing China-Taiwan's tense relationship? Taiwan is popular in India. That's more of a comment. But in terms of the U.S., the change post the Yoshida Isuga and Biden summit in Washington, D.C., and the statement there, which you mentioned Taiwan. I don't know if there was any arm twisting involved there. But for the first time since 1969, how significant is that?
It's pretty significant. I mean, it's been 52 years since the U.S. President and the Japanese Prime Minister have even mentioned Taiwan in their sort of joint press conferences. I think this is part and parcel of a wider regional recognition that China has become more aggressive. We have to take some sort of cooperative steps to kind of push back against it. And Taiwan is kind of the linchpin to this. Now, that said, there is a hard limit, it seems, on how far the Asian states and Asian peoples are willing to push on this. Taiwan has had problems just getting enough money to purchase new weapons. I would say that if you look at South Korea, they're far more interested in the South Korea-North Korea relationship and not necessarily kind of ruffling the Chinese feathers, which kind of makes sense from their perspective. What is notable to me is that you had a pretty big shift in administration in the United States, but the U.S. very much kept a lot of the the Biden administration kept a lot of the Trump administration's sort of approach to China. Now, they did it better. They were getting allies on their side. They're not engaging necessarily in a trade war with Europe. At the same time, they're trying to do a trade war with China. But they kind of took the momentum that was established by the Trump administration and carried it forward. I think even more notable than the Japanese Prime Minister and President Biden meeting was the one between Tony Blinken and what's his name? No, it's not Wen Jiabao. Wang Jiechi in Anchorage, where it came off pretty both sides were just not happy with each other. And that was a pretty clear signal of the direction that relations are going in.
Yeah, Gigi and Wang Yi. I don't know whether you'd agree with Shai Desi, who says that Taiwan's diplomatic clout is growing worldwide. There are 15 countries or so that recognize Taiwan, but in terms of what's happening at the WHO or the World Health Assembly, I think on the 24th of this month,
right,
there are a lot of countries, the EU, of course, America, and other countries who are trying to push for Taiwan's being present.
Yeah,
because of how they've handled COVID, and of course, there's a message there.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't overstate Taiwan's sort of international profile. It's still only a handful of countries in Africa and Latin America that recognize Taiwan. Yes, you have strong support within the United States, but it is still informal, or at least it's in American domestic law with the Taiwan Relations Act, not part of American foreign policy. That said, with the WTO, it's nice to see that there's an international push to get Taiwan into the WTO, but it's been China's long-standing policy that Taiwan should not participate in any international institution where its sovereign states are members. And so, because the PRC has been a pretty big contributor to sort of the WHO's discretionary fund, which the WHO has been drawing on more and more and more, it puts a big roadblock unless other countries are willing to pony up cash as well. And even then, it's unlikely that the WHO will allow Taiwan in even as an observer. Now, China has been providing Taiwan with information about COVID, but this is overall just bad policy, right? Because diseases spread, viruses spread. And so if you don't have that international coordination, it's especially for a country that is a trade and commerce hub like Taiwan, it's harder to control a global pandemic, and we just don't know when the next global pandemic's going to come. So keeping Taiwan out of the WHO just doesn't make a lot of scientific or health sense. It makes a lot of political sense for China, however.
Sometimes when there has been a precedent where Taiwan has been observed at the WHO, when I think the Chinese head as well. The times are different now.
Sorry, I just kind of missed that. Sorry about that.
I'm saying that the times when Taiwan was allowed by China, right, even when it had a head of the WHO as an observer, is different from political times now. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And I think in part it's also because of who's in office in Taiwan right now, which is the DPP. In this kind of strange way, which I'm still kind of wrapping my head around, that the Chinese government is just much closer with the KMT party in Taiwan. And so whenever the new KMT president comes into office, relations automatically improve. And even if nothing's actually changed, and I think Tsai Ing-wen has actually charted a pretty safe and middle course between China, Taiwan, and the United States. Even when nothing has changed, China just has to build up its rhetoric against the supposed independence movements that they seem to perceive, that kind of thing. So there is that element too. And in the middle of a pandemic, this just doesn't make any sense. You want to get information, you want to get control, you want to share lessons learned. And Taiwan, New Zealand, a few other countries have done a great job in terms of controlling the coronavirus without, say, inhibiting civil liberties and freedom of movement. You want to learn from that, and it's just not happening.
Right. When you look at Sure. You mentioned the Taiwan Relations Act now, vis-a-vis, say, Philippines or Japan, they are mutual defense treaties. And Varun Pratap has this question for you. In case of aggression, what would be the response of the United States as per U.S. Taiwan Relations Act? The U.S. doesn't guarantee its intervention to help Taiwan, but then again, it hasn't ruled it out, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. I was actually chatting with some friends who are legal scholars about this, because I'm not a legal scholar myself. And the issue here is this, that yes, the U.S. does not have a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. The U.S. doesn't consider Taiwan a sovereign state, so it's not going to do that. But the Taiwan Relations Act is U.S. domestic law. So to some extent, doesn't maybe therefore it has higher standing than, say, an executively ratified treaty between the U.S. and another country. But be that as it may, I never really got a good explanation for that. But there may be some sort of legal juggling that you can do based on that. I think the bigger issue is, yes, the Taiwan Relations Act does not require the United States to defend Taiwan. It just requires it to provide the capabilities for Taiwan to defend itself. That said, the United States has a really strong interest in the absence of Taiwan declaring independence. It has a really strong interest in defending Taiwan because it is, it's part of that first island chain. Controlling Taiwan, I think this was General MacArthur called it an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And when he was talking about that, he was actually referring to what happens if Chinese communists got control of Taiwan, that they would be able to use the island to project power into the Pacific region. And so I think it's widely seen as kind of a linchpin. And so you're going to get, even though there's no sort of formal treaty, you'll have strategic interests as well as allies like Japan, the Philippines, pushing for defense of Taiwan.
Right. I mean, there's another question from Ashish Kumar. The Quad itself has raised hackles in Beijing, but he's trying to take it further here by saying, is there any proposal being given to Taiwan by the Quad for a Quad Plus? Of course, that would take it to a completely different level. I don't think that's politically quite happening right now. If you're interested to join the Quad, but is that something just too far ahead on the road?
I think so, unfortunately. I mean, I have another book coming out in June where I advocate for NATO in Asia, which goes even further than the Quad. So maybe my recommendations are kind of pie in the sky too. But right now, I would at least say that the Asia Pacific region has a organizational gap. You have, say, AC on the southern side. You have maybe the APEC conference that happens, but there's no real sustained security and economic dialogue amongst a core group of states, where you have the sort of, if you look at Europe, for example, you've got NATO, you've got the EU, you've got these overlapping institutions where states constantly meet with each other and they kind of bind together in their foreign policies. You don't really have that in Asia. And even the ones that you do have, like ASEAN, they work on consensus decision making, which means that any actor, like say the Chinese putting pressure on Cambodia, can veto things like a South China Sea Code of Conduct. So for me, at least, the Quad is a good step towards filling this organizational gap, but it's not enough. The U.S. in particular needs to take leadership and gather together like-minded states, especially economically and militarily weighty ones like India and Japan, and actually bring them all together into a cohesive organization that can respond collectively to, say, Chinese aggression and moves.
The book you're referring to comes out in August, right? As of now?
June, August? They haven't really told me an exact date. Sometime this year. Yeah. I have a cover for it. That's good.
Yeah, I saw that. In terms of India, what are your thoughts on Taiwan? Now, of course, India would play its foreign policy in terms of Tibet or Taiwan or Hong Kong was not really, up in your face till last year. What happened in Galwan on the northern borders, and then there were there's a lot of questioning of how India should change possibly its foreign policy of one China. How do you see, and there have been, things that have irritated Beijing a lot in terms of even just tweets between Taiwanese and Indian officials on festivals and meeting. We have a pretty senior diplomat in Taiwan as well. But how do you see India playing the its strategy there?
So I have to say, like, it's been a long time since I focused on Indian foreign policy. So excuse my ignorance about this one. I would say that it strikes me as much of the Asia Pacific region, that includes the United States, has been, for the last, say, 20, 30 years or so, has been unsure about, has been trying to tack a middle line with regard to China. That it's economically rising, it represents an important market, but there are things like human rights or security issues where the regional states do not agree with what China's doing. And now I think that that needle has moved far more towards the security side. And so I think, given India's relations with Tibet, with its border territorial disputes with China, there are a lot of flashpoints between India and China, and it can also kind of leverage China's flashpoints with, I think, 17 other territorial disputants. There's a lot of, I suppose I think of it this way. It's about systems, where which sort of global actors are in a better position to create systems that bolster their domestic and international foreign policies. China right now is trying to create its own system, but it has so many sort of flashpoints and disagreements with other states. It just becomes that just becomes overwhelming. It becomes kind of friction or pebbles in like the mechanisms that kind of hold everything back. Whereas, say, for example, the United States and India have far less that they disagree upon. And so they can come together and create systems that benefit both sides and eventually attract other Asian regional states into the system and to isolate China.
Now, when you see the situation in terms of the military movement of the Chinese, both the PLA Navy, the Air Force, and the Americans who conduct their naval exercises there. There's been again a lot of talk because of the friction that there can be incident which just snowballs into a conflict. How do you read that?
I mean, it's extremely dangerous, right? The idea here that we would get into a war, that the United States would get into a war with China, especially over an issue like Taiwan, we're talking like very quickly probably getting into nuclear escalation. And that's something that nobody wants. I think the difficulty here is the use of gray zone warfare. That because we realize we don't want to get to a conventional or nuclear escalation, that's fine. But it also suggests that if you keep things below that level, and you can capture quite a lot. And so in the book that's actually over my shoulder here, the one on gray zone warfare, what I argue is that political cohesion amongst regional states is the most important thing. That if China is trying to assert itself using sub-conventional forces, that you develop a region-wide response to that. China has very, very impressive and very numerous sub-conventional capabilities, the Chinese Coast Guard and the PAFFM, the Maritime Militia. But in totality, the non-Chinese Asian Pacific states have equal numbers of forces as well at that sub-conventional level. They're just not coordinated. And so if you can get that coordination, you can actually push back against this sort of incursions by the Chinese. I would not want to see a war between China and the United States over Taiwan. But I think my preferred strategy would be to contain China much as the U.S. did for the USSR, and hopefully let the internal contradictions within the state kind of guide it towards a better foreign policy.
Dr. Raymond Kuo, we absolutely appreciate your time and expertise, and just put out another one of the comments from our viewers, Amitabh, who says, thank you so much. Thanks again, Dr. Kuo.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure was all ours. And just a reminder to our viewers, if you want to know when we put up videos like this one, First of all, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then just click on that bell icon. You'll be notified for videos, whether we go live or we post them for premieres. If you like our kind of journalism and you can help support it, do go onto our website and do follow our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. You've been watching The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.